The blistering Texas sun hung high in the sky, its rays casting a punishing heat over the barren landscape. The wind, which normally brought a semblance of relief, was little more than a dry breeze that only stirred the dust in the air, leaving behind a suffocating atmosphere. Jessie Lambert, her body broken and battered, stood alone in the middle of the dusty ranch yard. Her once vibrant dress clung to her thin, malnourished body like a second skin. The fabric was torn and ragged, stained with the dirt and blood of the past days. It had been weeks since she had seen the comfort of a full meal, let alone any sort of kindness. The men gathered around her, 3 of them, each more brutish than the last. They circled her like vultures, leering with cruel smiles, their eyes filled with malicious intent. Jessie could feel the weight of their gaze as they closed in, pushing her toward the wall of the barn. Her heart raced in her chest, her hands shaking uncontrollably at her sides. She had been through so much, and yet this was different. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about dignity, and the men knew it. They had stripped her of everything else. "Get over there," one of them grunted, his breath foul, his boots kicking up dirt with each step. Jessie stumbled, her legs barely able to support her, the sweat clinging to her skin. She wanted to scream, wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The wide, empty land stretched out before her, an endless void that offered no escape. The ranch was isolated, far from the reach of the law. She had no family left to turn to, no one who would believe her. They all thought she was guilty of stealing the cattle, even though she knew in the depths of her soul she hadn't taken a single one. It didn't matter. The truth was irrelevant when the men in charge were the ones who wrote the rules. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, girl," another man said, his voice low, full of menace. "You're here because you stole from us. Now, you'll pay the price." Her voice broke as she tried to speak, but the words came out ragged, barely audible. "Please, don't make me undress." Her plea hung in the air, fragile and desperate. It was as if the whole world paused for a moment, holding its breath before the men laughed. It was a sickening sound, one that made her stomach twist with disgust. One of them shoved her shoulder roughly, sending her staggering backward, the sharp pain of the contact shooting through her body. She fought to remain upright, her mind reeling, her heart pounding with terror. Her hands clutched at her torn shirt, the fabric barely covering her, but it was all she had left. She wasn't going to let them take that from her too, not without a fight. But what could she do? She was alone, alone in a place where no one cared. Her eyes darted around the yard, desperately searching for anything, anyone who might help. But there was nothing. The ranch was silent, save for the sound of the men's cruel laughter. No one would come. No one ever did. The only thing she could rely on was herself, but even that was a shaky foundation. How long could she endure this? How long could she keep going when everything, her dignity, her life, was being ripped away piece by piece? Then, in the distance, the sound of boots hitting the dirt broke through the tension. Slow, deliberate, heavy. The footsteps were steady, firm, and they carried a weight that made even the men pause. It was the kind of sound that made them stop talking, stop laughing. And for a brief moment, Jessie thought she could hear the world holding its breath again. Thomas Gates was a man of few words. A rancher by trade, his hands were rough from years of hard labor, his face weathered by the harsh Texas sun. At 58, he had seen enough of the world to understand its cruelty. but he had also seen enough of its beauty to know it was worth fighting for. He wasn't a hero, nor did he seek out trouble. He simply did what needed to be done. He stepped around the corner of the barn, his shadow falling over the scene like a dark cloud. The ranch hands froze, their eyes widening as they recognized the figure before them. They knew better than to challenge him. Thomas didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to make them second-guess their actions. He looked at Jessie first, his eyes softening with an unspoken understanding. Then, his gaze shifted to the men who had been tormenting her. His jaw tightened, and for the first time that day, the air seemed to crackle with tension. He wasn't here to negotiate. He wasn't here to make demands. He was here because what they were doing was wrong, and that was something Thomas Gates couldn't ignore. "Back away," he said, his voice low but commanding. The words landed in the stillness, like a stone dropped into a pond rippling outward. The ranch hands hesitated, their eyes flickering between each other, unsure of what to do. They had heard of Thomas Gates before, rumors of his quiet strength, of his unwavering resolve. For a long moment no one moved. The wind blew through the barn, lifting the strands of Jessie's tangled hair, but she didn't dare to look up. She was ashamed, embarrassed by the way she had been treated, by the weakness she felt in that moment. But Thomas wasn't judging her. He wasn't looking at her like the others had, with disdain or pity. He was simply there, standing between her and the men who had made her feel less than human. The ranch hands eventually backed off, muttering under their breath as they retreated toward the corral. Jessie let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding, the tightness in her chest easing just slightly. She still didn't feel safe. She still didn't feel whole, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't alone. Thomas stepped forward, shrugging off his dusty coat and draping it over her shoulders without a word. The coat was heavy, warm, and comforting. It smelled of leather and hard work, and it made Jessie feel something she hadn't felt in a long time, something soft, something human. She didn't say anything as he led her across the yard. She didn't have the strength to speak. All she could do was follow him, her feet dragging in the dirt, her mind still reeling from the terror she had just faced. They reached a small storage room behind his house, the door creaking as Thomas pushed it open. Inside was simple, just a narrow bed, a wooden chair, and a small table. But to Jessie, it felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a place where she might actually be able to rest, to heal. Thomas placed a bucket of warm water on the floor and set a folded dress beside it. "You can lock the door from the inside," he said quietly, his voice steady. "No one will bother you here." Her throat tightened at the words. No one would bother her. It seemed almost impossible to believe, but for some reason, in this moment, she wanted to trust him. She wanted to believe that there was still good in the world, that there was still a place for her to be safe. As Jessie slowly undressed and stepped into the warm water, she couldn't help but think that this might be the beginning of something different. She didn't know what that was yet, but she could feel it in her bones, a glimmer of hope, fragile and fleeting, but present nonetheless. After she finished, Thomas left her a plate of cornbread outside the door. He didn't knock. He simply set it down and walked away, leaving her in the quiet of the room. Jessie stared at the food for a long time, the hunger in her stomach gnawing at her. But the fear was still too strong. She didn't know if she could trust the kindness. She didn't know if it would come with a price. But the next night, she opened the door a little, just enough to whisper a quiet thank you. And on the third night, she ate. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was the first step toward regaining the trust she had lost. Trust in herself, in others, in a world that had turned its back on her. Jessie woke early the next morning, before the sun had fully risen. The room was quiet, almost sacred in its stillness, and she could hear the soft rustle of wind outside the small window. The faint scent of cedarwood from the beams above mingled with the fresh earthiness of the ranch yard. And for the first time in what seemed like forever, Jessie didn't feel like she was on the edge of something that might break her. No, here, in this moment, she felt like she might just start rebuilding. She sat up in the small bed, her feet touching the cold wooden floor, and hugged her knees to her chest. The dress Thomas had given her, the simple cotton one, felt like an armor, something that wrapped around her with its soft, unspoken protection. She could still feel the warmth of his coat on her shoulders, the weight of it settling over her like a shield. She hadn't felt warmth like that in years. The fear hadn't left, not completely, but it was softer now. Fainter. For the first time in a long time, Jessie didn't feel like a ghost, as if the land itself had finally recognized her existence. Maybe it was Thomas's quiet strength, or the fact that he hadn't judged her for the things she had been through. Whatever it was, she wasn't running anymore. She didn't have to. The small room behind the barn had become her haven. The air inside felt cleaner, lighter, and Jessie slowly began to let herself believe it might be real. It had only been 2 days since she had been rescued, if it could be called that. And yet, in these 2 short days, her perspective had shifted. She no longer felt like the world was closing in on her, suffocating her with its cruelty. Instead, she started to see it as something she could face again, something that wouldn't swallow her whole. By the time the sun had risen, casting golden light over the dusty horizon, Jessie stepped outside. The morning air was still cool and pleasant, a stark contrast to the heat that would come later in the day. She could hear the faint sound of the ranch dogs barking in the distance and the creaking of the windmill by the fence. It was quiet, almost peaceful, and yet there was a nagging sense of unease at the back of her mind. She walked across the yard to the small corral where the horses were kept, their forms silhouetted against the rising sun. Jessie wasn't a horsewoman by nature, but something about them calmed her. They were strong, graceful creatures, a reminder that there was still beauty in the world, even here in the desolate plains of Texas. Thomas was at the corral, working on a fence post that had come loose. His broad shoulders were bent as he worked, his movements steady and deliberate. Jessie watched him from a distance, unsure of what to say or how to approach him. He was a man of few words, but in those words there was a depth she couldn't quite understand. She had never met someone like him, someone who offered help without question, without any expectation of something in return. Finally, she mustered the courage to approach him. She kept her steps light, her feet barely making a sound on the dirt path. When she reached him, Thomas looked up, his face unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet of the morning wrapping around them like a blanket. "I'm going to need your help with something," Jessie said, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't know why she spoke, why the words had come out of her mouth. It wasn't like her to ask for help, let alone from someone she barely knew. But something in Thomas's steady gaze made her feel like she could ask. It was as if he knew exactly what she needed, even if she didn't know herself. He didn't reply immediately, but his eyes softened, a small flicker of understanding passing between them. Without a word, he stood up from the corral and gestured toward the barn. "I'll be inside. When you're ready, we'll talk." Jessie nodded, feeling a tight knot form in her throat. She had never felt comfortable with people, with asking for help. But Thomas wasn't just anyone. He had already given her more than she ever expected, and now she was about to ask him for more. She followed him into the barn, where he kept various tools and supplies. It was cooler inside, the smell of wood and hay mixing in the air. Jessie stood by the door, unsure of how to begin. Thomas moved toward the back of the barn, gathering a few tools in his hands. When he turned around, he raised an eyebrow, silently urging her to speak. "I don't know where to start," Jessie admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I need to get back to town. There's something I have to do." Thomas didn't flinch. He didn't ask why or press her for details. He simply nodded and placed the tools on a nearby table. "We'll leave when you're ready," he said quietly. His words were simple, but they were enough. They gave her permission to feel like she wasn't trapped in this moment, that there was a way out if she could just find the strength to move forward. It was strange, but Jessie felt like she was taking the first steps towards something bigger, something beyond the ranch. She didn't know if she was ready to face her past, but Thomas had shown her that it was possible. It didn't matter how hard it was, how impossible it seemed. The truth would set her free, even if it was buried in fear. The two of them spent the next few hours preparing. Jessie helped Thomas with small tasks around the barn, feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. There was something comforting about the work, the simple act of keeping busy, of making the ranch function like it was meant to. It was hard, physically demanding, but it felt like she was finally doing something with her life, something real. As the day wore on, the tension in the air grew. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its heat oppressive as it bore down on the land. By midday, Jessie and Thomas were saddling up the horses. They would be riding to Dodge City, the place where Jessie's past had begun to unravel. It was a place she had hoped to forget, a place she had been running from for years. But now, she couldn't hide anymore. "Are you sure about this?" Thomas asked as he handed her the reins of her horse. He didn't say it in a way that doubted her decision. It was more of an acknowledgement, a quiet question that allowed her the space to change her mind if she needed to. Jessie took the reins with a steady hand. "I have to," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I can't run forever." Thomas nodded, his eyes still unreadable. He didn't need to say anything else. The decision had been made. They rode out of the ranch in silence, the wind whipping past them as they moved across the plains. The land seemed endless, a stretch of dusty earth that offered no promise, no relief. But for Jessie, it wasn't the land that mattered anymore. It was what lay ahead, the chance to finally face her demons, to stand up for herself in a world that had made her feel so small. As they rode, Jessie couldn't help but wonder what awaited her in Dodge City. The town had a reputation, a rough one. It was the kind of place where men like Brock Hensley thrived, where debts were settled in dark alleys, and the law was often a matter of personal convenience. But this time, it was different. She wasn't going to face Brock alone. She wasn't going to let him define her anymore. The journey was long, the sun beginning to set as they neared the town. Jessie's stomach churned with anxiety, but she kept her focus on the road ahead. She couldn't afford to turn back now. "We're almost there," Thomas said, his voice breaking the silence between them. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, and Jessie knew that this was the moment she had to decide, to confront her past or to keep running. But there was no more running, not this time. As the lights of Dodge City came into view, Jessie's heart raced, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from something stronger, something she hadn't felt in years: hope. The sun had long dipped below the horizon by the time Jessie and Thomas reached the outskirts of Dodge City. The town loomed ahead like a shadow, its edges blurred by the haze of a hot summer night. The distant sound of a horse-drawn carriage clattering down the dusty streets mixed with the faint murmur of voices rising from the saloons and market stalls. This was a town that never slept, a place where desperation and opportunity collided at every turn. Jessie's heart pounded in her chest as they approached the main road. It had been years since she'd set foot in Dodge City, and the memories that surged back were as sharp as a whip. She remembered the sting of the saloon owner's hand as he dragged her through the back door, his grip tightening like a vice. She remembered the whispers, the looks, the feeling of being owned, traded, discarded. But none of that mattered now. She wasn't the same scared girl anymore. Jessie had learned what it meant to fight for herself. She had learned that no matter how dark the world seemed, there was always a sliver of light waiting to be found. And now, standing beside Thomas, she was ready to face the past she had run from for so long. The two of them rode through the narrow, crooked streets of the town, the sound of hooves echoing off the wooden buildings. Jessie's breath was shallow, but she kept her focus ahead. She wasn't going to let the weight of memories drag her down. She couldn't afford to. This was her moment, the moment when she would stand up and take control of her own fate. As they neared the sheriff's office, Thomas slowed his horse to a trot. Jessie followed suit, the horse's hooves tapping softly against the cobblestones. They didn't speak as they dismounted and walked toward the wooden door of the small office. The building was unassuming, tucked between a livery and a general store, but to Jessie, it represented a chance at something bigger than survival. It represented the possibility of justice. When they entered, the sheriff's office was quiet, the air thick with the smell of old paper and tobacco smoke. Behind the desk sat a man in his early 40s, his hat low over his brow as he scribbled in a ledger. Sheriff Jacob Garrison looked up when the door creaked, his sharp eyes narrowing as they took in Thomas and Jessie. He wasn't surprised to see them. He had heard rumors of their arrival, whispers of trouble stirring in the air. "Thomas," the sheriff said, his voice gravelly but warm. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Thomas gave a short nod. "We need to talk about Brock Hensley." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping on the edge of the desk. "I figured that's why you're here." Jessie felt the weight of his gaze, the unspoken question swirling in the air. But he didn't ask her to explain. He didn't demand that she relive the horrors she had suffered. Instead, he simply nodded toward a chair. "Sit down, Jessie," he said gently. Jessie hesitated for a moment before taking a seat. The sheriff's calm demeanor made it easier to breathe, to let go of the tightness that had clung to her chest since they entered the town. She knew that nothing could change the past, but maybe, just maybe, this could be the first step toward making things right. "Brock's a problem around here," Sheriff Garrison said, his voice low and filled with a weariness that spoke of years of dealing with men like him. "He's been running his little empire of fear for too long, but I didn't have enough to put him away, not until now." He turned his gaze to Jessie, his expression softening. What do you need me to do? Jessie swallowed hard, her throat dry. This was the moment she had been dreading, but also the one she had been yearning for. She wasn't asking for revenge. She wasn't asking for mercy. She was asking for something simpler, justice. He's been hurting people, Jessie said, her voice shaking but firm. He's done things I just need him to stop. The weight of her words felt like a burden, but she carried it with a sense of determination. She had carried it for so long. It was time to let it go. Sheriff Garrison leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with understanding. We've got enough now to move on him, but it's going to take more than just your word. I'll need witnesses, proof that he's been running this little game of his for far too long. Jessie felt her stomach twist. She had no proof, no documents, no receipts. She only had her word, her testimony, and the truth. And for all the years she had spent running from the truth, she knew she couldn't turn back now. There's a man, Thomas spoke up, his voice calm but filled with conviction. A man who's seen things. He's a rancher just outside of a town, and he's got the evidence we need. But Brock's been intimidating him too. The sheriff's eyes flickered with concern. You think he'll talk? Thomas didn't hesitate. If we get to him first, he will. Jessie nodded, her heart beating faster. She wasn't sure what would happen next. She wasn't sure what kind of man Brock Hensley truly was, or how deep his influence ran. But she was done waiting. She was done hiding. This was her fight now, and no one was going to stop her from seeing it through. The sheriff stood up, grabbing his hat from the hook by the door. All right, let's go get the proof we need. You two follow me. The three of them left the office and mounted their horses again, riding out of the town and toward the ranch where the man Thomas had mentioned lived. The wind picked up as they rode, a cool breeze that seemed to carry with it a sense of anticipation. The trees along the road blurred past them, and Jessie's mind raced. She wasn't sure what she expected to find. She wasn't sure how far this would go, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let Brock Hensley hurt anyone else. Not if she had the power to stop him. As they approached the ranch, Thomas slowed his horse, his eyes scanning the horizon. This is it, he said, pulling his horse to a stop. The small ranch house stood at the edge of a field, surrounded by a few dilapidated barns. The land looked empty, abandoned even, but Jessie could feel the tension in the air. The man they were here to speak to had to know they were coming. The door of the ranch house opened, and a tall man in his late 40s stepped out. His clothes were worn, and his face was rugged, but there was a glint of fear in his eyes as he looked toward them. You came, the man said, his voice low and uncertain. I wasn't sure if you would. We need your help, Thomas said, his tone steady. Brock's been hurting people, and we've got the sheriff here to make it right. The man hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the distant barn. For a moment, Jessie thought he might turn them away. That fear might win again. But then slowly he nodded. I've seen things, the man said, his voice cracking slightly. Things I couldn't ignore anymore. Sheriff Garrison stepped forward, his hand resting on the man's shoulder. Tell us what you know. And just like that, the truth started to unravel.